Changing context in Australian education. In 1788, the British invaded the continent now known as Australia. A mass genocide and onslaught against Aboriginal inhabitants ensued, enforcing a system of racial discrimination and white privilege. A cultivated fear of the criminal class in English society ideologically fed the colonisation of Australia, which would serve as a jail of no return for convicts. In 1802, Governor Bligh wanted to withdraw children of convict families from the destructive connections and examples of their dissolute parents. Young girls were removed from their homes and placed in orphanages to provide them with an education to fit them for work and discourage them from prostitution. In 1802, Governor Macquarie advocated for schooling for the control of the lower classes, to develop the morals of the lower orders and develop religious principles in the young, to make them more dutiful and obedient, and enforce that they be separated as much as possible from the adverse moral influence of their parents. Aboriginal children were placed in schools during this period, with the purpose that they become labourers and semi-skilled workers. Between 1850 to 1930, Aboriginals were excluded from mainstream education by legal clauses that allowed their removal. Children were often removed from their homes and their culture was significantly undermined. Schooling was provided on mission stations and in government reserves, but had a severe lack of trained personnel and resources. Parents also had the legal right in mainstream schools to request the removal of an Aboriginal student from school if they did not desire their child to learn alongside them. Aboriginal children were taken from their parents and told that it was for the sake of their education, though children reported that it was for the training in menial jobs and cheap labour in the wider community. The purpose of their removal was to assimilate them into accepting white values and taking on menial work in society. From the 1850s, schooling was modelled upon the Irish national school system and was mostly provided by private tutors, church organisations and private venture schools. 2 years of any kind of education for most classes was above the average. Children of poor settlers hardly attended school at all. Informal dame schools competed with elementary schools which had funding from church and colonial governments. Working class children went to school on and off for several years. The middle classes attended elementary schools and private academies. The daughters of the rich were often entirely homeschools, and the sons of the wealthy attended wealthy private schools and went on to the public universities. Under the Education Act in 1875, South Australia became the first state to introduce state-supported secular and compulsory schooling. Victoria followed in 1872 and New South Wales in 1880. Gutter children, however, were not swept up into these schools for fear that they would somehow impair the tone. The first universities were established on the British schooling model around the 1850s. The attendees of these universities, mostly from the middle and upper classes, had a virtual monopoly over professional employment. From the late 1880s, women were gradually allowed to attend universities. Schooling up to that point had largely been to train women to remain in the home or to enter into caring and generally lower paid professions such as nursing or teaching. World War II saw a massive influx of women into the workforce as men went off to war. Following the women's movement of the 1960s, we saw a broadening of professional opportunities for women in the workforce. Post-World War II, there was a mass rising in mass secondary schooling. Between 1956 and 1962, state secondary school enrolments doubled. The number of universities almost tripled by 1972. Aboriginal people, in the meanwhile, were only just coming to be recognised as citizens to be counted in the census, and following their successful freedom rides in 1965, were even allowed to vote. The class distinction between academic and applied knowledge extended to the tertiary sector. In the neoliberal era of education, attacks have ensued. In 1989, the Hawke-Keating government introduced HECS, initially meant to be a $250 fee loan to substitute an admin fee. Kennett destroyed 9,000 permanent teaching jobs and closed over 350 schools. Howard introduced voluntary student unionism, cuts to higher education funding by over $5 billion, increased HECS by up to 168%, axed 20,000 government-funded student places, and the list goes on. Education is currently one of the most profitable sectors in Australia. As an export, reaping $14.461 billion in the 2012 to 2013 financial year. There's been a massive shift to privatisation and user pays in a publicly subsidised education system. The Labor government legislated in 1972 to provide funding to all schools based on need, including private schools in the model. So this is happening at both secondary and at a tertiary level education. TAFE was all but gutted by an opening up to the private market. The government increased their funding under the Brumby government in 2008 to private registered training organisations. Public school funding has remained below inflation in 2014, despite private school funding from a government level generally increasing to higher than inflation each year. Victoria currently has the lowest spending rate on public education per student in comparison with other states in Australia. Australia has a continuing push towards privatisation. Continual funding cuts of over $600 million since the Abbott government have come in, with forecasted further cuts under the 2015 proposed budget. Teachers continue to lose their jobs in the sector, be burdened with increased workloads, and have job insecurity and mass increase in casualisation. Conditions need to improve. Rather than pitting workers against each other and schools against each other and shaming those underperforming schools via My Schools and NAPLAN, there needs to be an investment in education and an improvement in conditions for teachers. In the meantime, we can get organised. Sydney University staff collaborated with students and striked due to the failure of management to address teachers' concern about workload and conditions. They want an increase in redundancy entitlements, improved conversion to ongoing and fixed-term jobs for casual staff, amongst a myriad of other demands that they had made. The unions have the unique ability to mobilise tens of thousands of people. Organising in our workplaces and in the unions is going to be one of the main ways that we can push back these neoliberal attacks on education. If you're a student, there are protests and National Union of Students organise demonstrations regularly that people can attend.